one of the poets too. So
Welcome, everyone. Here we are. It's the noon hour, and so time for some Torah. Let's settle in and just acknowledge the many different things that are vying for our attention at this time in the world, in our homes, in our own minds, and see if we can just put those things on pause for the next little while and say a bracha together to acknowledge this little sanctuary in space that we're creating for our study. Join me, please. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We have left the book of Numbers, and this week are beginning a new book of the Torah, the final book of the 5 books, the Book of Deuteronomy, which has its own unique role in the whole landscape of the Tanakh. And I'd like to take a few minutes with you today just to talk about Deuteronomy as a book, what we understand about it from within rabbinic tradition, and then I have some things to share with you that are actually from some Christian theologians that speak to different ideas about the documentary hypothesis, which is that notion that the whole Tanakh is, or let's say the Torah is a composite of different authors. So these theologians, you'll see, have some other ideas to put in front of us. And then my hope is maybe somewhere during the second half of the hour to switch and actually look at some psukim, some actual pieces from Deuteronomy that are going to bring up a tricky question, very tough question for us, for me at least, and I bet for you all as well. Okay, so first, just to sort of step back, if you will, and in our mind's eye, just take in the image of the whole 5 books and understand that having completed the first 4, we've completed the story of the Torah. And we're now going into the final book, which is going to attempt to distill that whole experience of journeying, of searching for God, and as it presents itself to us through the words of Moses, to try to make sense out of where we've been and where we're supposed to be going. And of course, I think we're in this group, we're all familiar with the end of Deuteronomy ends with Moshe Rabbeinu coming to the end of his own life in view of the prize, so to speak, the promised place, and also not able to attain it himself, and making some peace with that, I think, perhaps. So I want to begin. I have a lot of material in our source sheet, so I'm going to try to just move through some of it quickly because there's no way we'll get through all of it in this 1 hour. So here's where we are for today, and our title is "Start with the end in mind," which I'm sure you all have heard as a kind of a principle for teaching, planning, meetings, all kinds of different things. So where are you trying to go? And then let's build around that. And I was dwelling on this, even just this title, because of the idea that perhaps actually, even though we think of Deuteronomy as the final book of the Torah, it may have been the beginning of the creation of the Torah. That is to say, the ancestral stories from Genesis, Exodus, a little bit Leviticus and Numbers, Bamidbar, all predate Deuteronomy, but were only organized into what we recognize as the Torah around the creation of Deuteronomy. So I'd like to begin with you today by looking at a passage from 2 Kings, the second book of Kings, which I think you'll recognize, but anyway, we'll look at it together in just a moment. This passage from 2 Kings is going to describe a moment in biblical history, as you can see already on the text. It's during the reign of King Josiah. And by the time we get to the part I want to look at with you, will be, just to put it in context, it's the reign of King Josiah, and more than likely, almost certainly, the time of the prophet Jeremiah. So imagine Jeremiah, I always picture him, like with his head in his hand, going to Josiah and saying, don't you understand what's coming? In the midst of that relationship between Jeremiah and Josiah, Josiah begins a policy of reform, of trying to clean up the temple and trying to reunify spiritual practice in his kingdom, to get people to stop going to the temples of other gods and sacrificing to other gods, which apparently was a pretty seductive thing for our ancestors, because you see a lot of language in the Tanakh about how evil that was and how bad it was. And so here we are during this time of reform, King Josiah wanting to clean up the whole system. And it's in this context that we're tuning in now to chapter 22. He, under his leadership, the temple is being cleaned out. And so imagine, workers and other people actually physically cleaning it out, sweeping it out, organizing things, deciding what to keep, what to get rid of, etc. Okay, so let's dig into this a little bit. Let's go to verse 3 here. Maybe, Luther, would you be willing to read some here in the English?
Sure. In the 18th year, of King Hosea, the king sent the scribe Shaphan, son of Azariah, son of Meshullam, to the house of the Lord, saying, "Go to the high priest Hilkiah, and let him weigh the silver that has been deposited in the house of the Lord, which the guards of the threshold have collected from the people, and let it be delivered to the overseers of the work who are in charge at the house of the Lord, that they in turn may pay it out to the workmen that are in the house of the Lord for the repair of the house, to the
Keep going.
carpenters, the laborers, and the masons, and for the purchase of wood and quarried stones for repairing the house. However, no check is to be kept on them for the silver that is delivered to them, for they deal honestly."
Okay, so pause just for a second. Wonderful reading, as always. Just again, painting a picture for us of a very busy, a lot of going on in the temple. And imagine Hilkiah, as they're saying to us here, the high priest, who's sort of overseeing all of this cleaning up and straightening out, and not just cleaning up on a physical level, but also in the spiritual realm, kind of getting things in order. Okay, and then Luther, would you keep going?
Then the high priest Hilkiah said to the scribe Shaphan, "I have found a scroll of the teaching in the house of the Lord."
Okay, so this is, I bolded it because it's meant to catch our attention. And I tried to bold it in the Hebrew, but I don't know, it doesn't bold as well. Vayomer Chilkiyahu HaKohen HaGadol al Shaphan HaSofer, Sefer HaTorah Matzati Beveit Adonai. So this is something dramatic that's happening here. While we're sweeping up and cleaning up, pitom, suddenly, here's something rather important. And I wonder if we dug into some commentaries about this, which I didn't prepare for us, but if we did, I wonder if we would find some commentators who might say, it's being presented as if it were found, but perhaps it was actually written. So maybe it's that Shaphan the scribe or some other scribes that were present in this whole campaign of cleaning up, sat down and wrote down what they thought was important for the people to know. Okay, Luther, would you keep going then?
And Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan, who read it. The scribe Shaphan then went to the king and reported to the king, "Your servants have melted down the silver that was deposited in the house, and they have delivered it to the overseers of the work who are in charge at the house of the Lord."
Okay, keep going.
The scribe Shaphan also told the king, the high priest Hilkiah has given me a scroll. And Shaphan read it to the king. When the king heard the words of the scroll of the teaching, he rent his clothes. And the king gave orders to the priest Hilkiah and to Ahikam, son of Shaphan, Akbor, son of Micaiah, the scribe Shaphan, and Asaiah, the king's minister, Go inquire of the Lord on my behalf, and on behalf of the people, and on behalf of all Judah, concerning the words of this scroll that has been found. For great indeed must be the wrath of the Lord that has been kindled against us, because our fathers did not obey the words of this scroll to do all that has been prescribed for us.
Thank you. Okay, so there I put more of the Kings chapter 22 here, but let's just kind of say this is a good stopping point for us. We have the vignette of King Josiah hearing that this scroll has been found and then hearing the contents of the scroll, and at least in his mind, connecting the words of this Torah. They call it a Torah. It's not the same Torah that we think of, but it is a scroll of teaching, a scroll of law. And in his mind, he's connecting the instructions in this scroll, the lack of adherence to the instructions in this scroll, with the most difficult political situation that Judah is in at this time. And we know that King Josiah dies trying to defend his little kingdom against the Egyptians. So let's skip ahead now. There's more to read in Kings, but for now, let's go on. Okay, so just to refresh us, go ahead, Shlomo, you were going to say something.
Is he defending against the Egyptians or the impending Babylonians?
I'd have to go back and remind myself, but my memory is that he's at Megiddo, and he's defending against the Egyptians. He's in battle against the Egyptians, I think. And of course, it's the Egyptians really are, and the Babylonians that are fighting each other, and Judah is caught in the middle. And anyway, that's a long story with Jeremiah. Here's just an image of the contents of the Tanakh. I just thought it might be helpful for us to see, because the next chunk of material that I want to look at with you is going to ask us to sort of visualize all of this. This is actually from a Christian scholar, but I like the way he laid it out. You can see, just take note, here's Deuteronomy, and the way this scholar paints it, he's got it, as we understand it, in Jewish tradition. It's part of the 5 books. And then he makes, this scholar who put this together makes the connection between these and then into this next section. And just take this in, especially this part, for a minute, because what we're going to now look at is some other explanation about Deuteronomy. What is the role of Deuteronomy here in the creation of the Torah, the creation of the Tanakh? And I use that phrasing aware. I don't know about the different beliefs just in our own Zoom room here. I mean, just saying the creation of the Torah. I hope I'm not offending anyone here. For myself, I definitely follow the thinking that it was composed, written, created, I don't know, eventually published, and not given word for word at Sinai. To me, that does not diminish its sanctity or its power at all. In fact, it only strengthens it, since we say in our own Siddur, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. the Torah comes forth from Zion. It may be inspired by God, but it's our ancestors who wrote this history for us. Okay, so just keep this in mind, and we can return to this if we want to remember kind of the order of things and how they relate to each other. Okay, now going on to this. So this is some, I'm going to stop the share just because I think it gets to be a bit much. This is from this book, and I'm holding it up because I know about it thanks to Joel Kaufman, who I'd like to remember here, who was a longtime member and leader and the founder, I think, of our library. And not a trained rabbi, but a passionate student. And he, I think it was he who chose to have this volume on his founding of Dr. Lum's library. I got a copy for myself because I loved it so much. It's called Surpassing Wonder, The Invention of the Bible and the Talmuds. And it's by the Canadian theologian Donald Atkinson. So he's coming now from a different perspective. Very interesting for us to see what he has to say, pulling on the lineage of theology that he comes from about Deuteronomy. Okay, so again, this is because we're starting Deuteronomy this week and we'll be in Deuteronomy for many weeks. I wanted to just pause and just look at Deuteronomy as a book. Okay, so I'll go back to the share now. Okay, here's Donald Atkinson. Maybe somebody else want to read? And I have to say, when I read Donald Atkinson, he sounds so enthusiastic and animated to me. So feel free to have fun with this. I think I'd love to meet him someday and just see if he's as enthusiastic in person as he sounds in his writing. Maybe another reader, Matt Wald? I don't know. I'm just looking at
If there was ever a case of successful collaboration between inventor and audience, it is the first 9 books of the Hebrew Bible. Not only were they embraced by their exilic audience, they were carried eventually back to the city of Jerusalem, where they became the reference point for the establishment of a spiritual world. One cannot read these 9 books of history without entering into their world, arguing with them, interrogating them for hidden meanings. Genesis through Kings, a truly great invention.
Okay, so stop here. So let's just make sure we're all together here. He's saying the first 9 books of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, and he's going to explain more why he's picking on those in particular. But let's see. He means Genesis through Kings. So 5 plus 4. Everybody can see that. And he's going to tell us in a minute why he likes to talk about them as a unit. And he makes the point here that it was that unit, Genesis through Kings, that was really became a central pillar of community continuity during the exile, during the Babylonian exile, and then eventually carried back to Jerusalem, where under the leadership of Ezra and I guess Nehemiah, they became the center of pre-rabbinic Judaism, which is where we're still grappling and practicing together. Okay, so he wants us to think of Genesis through Kings. Okay, and there's a reason that we're going to get to Deuteronomy in a second. Okay, Matt, do you want to keep going?
I'm sorry, yeah, sure. Noted Bible scholar Gerard von Rad argued that certain books of the Hebrew Bible were a unity, that this could be demonstrated on the basis of their ideological oneness. This unity was independent of what the original sources of the material were. He called these books so united the Hexateuch, as they consisted of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and this was crucial, Joshua.
Okay, so just pause for a second. We're probably familiar with like the term Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. Von Rad says, well, I think you have to think of it with Joshua, because Joshua is the one that carries the story forward. Okay, so Matt, will you keep going now?
In the center, the pivot of this interpretation was a creed, which comprises chapter 26 of the Book of Deuteronomy. But it is not a creed in the modern sense of being a theological statement. Instead, it's a statement of beliefs about Israel and history. God created the world and chose the people of Israel as his own, brought them out of Egypt, led them to freedom, and eventually to settlement in the Promised Land. Around that hub of historical belief pivots all the narrative of Genesis through Joshua.
Okay, so we're getting a couple of different versions here. So we have, first we have Akinson himself, who says, well, think of it as Genesis through Kings. Right, you can see that here. Oh, come on, here. Genesis through Kings. And then he's going to break it down and say there are going to be two scholars that influenced his thinking. One is this Von Rad that Matt just read. Von Rad wants us to think of Genesis through Joshua. So Deuteronomy is not the end. Actually, Joshua is the completion of this unit. Okay? Maybe another reader? Is there maybe a woman in the gang here that would read? Audrey, you want to jump in?
We're
And
reciprocally,
reciprocally?
a contemporary of Von Rad, Martin Noth, makes the following argument. Although the sources that underlie Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers run into the Book of Deuteronomy, there begins with the first verse of Deuteronomy, a separate literary unit, one that continues to the end of Kings. This unit, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, was compiled by a single writer, Noth believed, whom he called the Deuteronomist. At the end of Numbers, there is a deep incision, Noth noted, for with Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, there begins the Deuteronomistic historical work, which fundamentally has nothing to do with the Pentateuch and became attached to it only later.
Okay, so interesting, right? He's
Yeah.
saying, now here's another perspective that says it's better for us to think of the first four books of Moses, which you can see where his thinking is coming from. Genesis through Numbers, it makes some sense that that would be a unit, and that then Deuteronomy through Kings is a unit, and that Deuteronomy is really almost as an introduction to the history that unfolds afterwards in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Okay, now let's see. Audrey, do you want to just continue here? Acceptance. This is now Akinson. He's saying, now this is what I think. I've given you what these two, influences think. What I learned, and here's how I understand it.
Okay, I can continue. Acceptance of the unity of the first 9 books of the Hebrew Bible as the invention of a single religious genius is dependent upon an understanding of the wonderful flexibility of the Book of Deuteronomy. It is not one thing, either the tie-up of the prehistory of the ancient Hebrew or the beginning of what in the context of the times as the nation's, quote, modern history. It is both. The editor cum author here knew exactly what he was doing. The Book of Deuteronomy is a strong spine with 2 mighty arms.
So just pause there. I just love
Yeah,
his.
that's great.
Deuteronomy is a strong spine with 2 mighty arms, one that connects itself back to the first 4 books, and the other that connects itself forward to the next 4 books. Okay, keep going.
That's a great image.
That's really beautiful.
That spine and those arms can support, on the one hand, the first 4 books of Moses, and on the other, the 4 former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. There is a symmetry here that is immensely skillful. The 4 books on each hand balance each other, and each set of 4 becomes a set of 5 because they thematically and historically integrated with the central volume, Deuteronomy.
That was my
I shouldn't say re.
Yeah, because they are thematically.
They are thematically and historically integrated with the central volume, Deuteronomy. By using the Book of Deuteronomy in this dual role, the editor, author, the inventor, was carving his own way to 2 sets of 5 tablets. Oh, that's great. He, the most self-aware of historians, knew full well that he was invoking here the image of the 2 sets of 5 laws brought down by Moses from the mountain in the establishment of the Sinai covenant.
Okay, so I don't know about you, but I read this years ago and then I wanted to go back to it. How interesting. So here's a different way to understand the role that Deuteronomy plays in relationship to the other books. I know I've looked with some of you. I think in a Yesodot class we had, we read a beautiful little piece by Nehemiah Poland, Rabbi Nehemiah Poland, who was describing also the creation of the Tanakh. And he was saying, Nehemiah Poland was saying, he always pictures, for a long time, there was no book with everything bound together. Everything was on a scroll. And so the scroll would be just carried around in a pouch, the scrolls, excuse me. And so they could get all jumbled up and out of order, and you never knew, it wasn't like now where you can open a Tanakh and see, okay, it starts with Genesis and it ends with Chronicles, etc. And that they somehow were all talking to each other. And I'm reminded of that as I read this Atkinson passage, which says Deuteronomy is, as he says, like that spine that holds together the first 4 books, the ancient history of the ancestors, and that shift into what we think of as history. The next 4 books, Joshua, which is maybe the camera lens is still fuzzy, and by the time we get to the end of Kings, we're in history. We have archaeological proof that these people existed, that their stories unfolded, more or less as was described. Okay, so that was this is all by way of saying, okay, welcome to Deuteronomy, and let's think about this interesting book that has a totally different tone of voice. It has a different, it's not just tone of voice. What do you call it? First person, second person. Now it's Moses speaking to the people, and not only God speaking to Moses to the people. Okay. From here, any objections, any interesting?
Yeah, this is the opposite of plagiarism. Plagiarism, which was not considered wrong in those days.
Right.
But this is passing off your own work as somebody else's.
For sure. You mean saying, oh, this came from Sinai. Is that what you mean, Matt? Yeah. Yeah. To try to give it some authenticity or some gravitas, something like that. Audrey, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd also say that, thank you for presenting this, because so often when we get to Deuteronomy, people just say, oh, well, this is just a recount of everything that happened before, and it's Moses' final statement, and that's that. And giving us this new kind of even image of the spine and the hands and all of that really helps invigorate what Deuteronomy is all about as we go forward, and just where this book stands. So it's great. It's not just a repeat. It's not just like a retelling of everything.
No, I think it's not. And Teichmans, I'm coming to you in 1 second. And I want to just connect this back to the passage we just read earlier from Kings 22, 2 Kings 22, which suggests to us that actually it began with Deuteronomy and the rest of it was created around Deuteronomy. Go ahead, Marcia or Kevin.
How does this relate, if at all, to the J and the P and the various authors who have done the analysis of the various books to see if those authors also split perhaps 4-1-4 or whatever?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Atkinson does address the documentary hypothesis. He doesn't have a lot of patience for it. So if that's our source for today, I think he's very disparaging of it. You just heard him say, it's one unit. It was one author who sat down and put this all together. We can agree or disagree with him about that. My very uneducated, I'm not no expert on this, but my understanding is the Deuteronomist in the documentary hypothesis that you're asking about, Kevin, is the voice in Deuteronomy. And I don't think you hear that voice outside of Deuteronomy. I don't know that you can point to it in any other part of the Torah. So if it's I always get this wrong, JEPD, the Yahwist, the Elohist, the priestly, and the Deuteronomist, only in Deuteronomy do we hear that lose your marbles here, Deuteronomistic voice, only in this text. So that's maybe
isn't Noth one of the authors of the
of the
Documentary
documentary
hypothesis.
hypothesis. He's definitely one of the ones who tried to address it, yes. Okay, I'm blanking on the name of the one who was the central author of the documentary hypothesis.
Alt.
Wellhausen, I think is the name. So interesting to come back to that another time. For today, I'd like to go ahead now and look with you at a little bit of Deuteronomy, some text from the Torah. And this is going to be now around the question of divine election, around the question of the Jewish people being the chosen people according to the text of the Torah, which, needless to say, is something that our whole movement has formed itself around as a question or as an objection. Okay, so let's look first at the Torah text itself. If I go back to screen share. Okay, we're done with not. Okay. So now we're in Deuteronomy chapter 7. There's a piece here, and then we'll go on to 10. Okay, so beginning with verse 12, V'haya ekev tishme'un et hamishpatim ha'ele ushmartem va'asitem otam. So there is a condition here. If you adhere to these rules, ushmartem va'asitem otam, remember them, observe them, and do them. V'shamar Adonai Elohecha lecha et habrit ve'et hachesed asher nishba la'avotecha. God will, what do we have here? Will, keep the covenant and also the relationship of love that was promised to your ancestors. Okay, everybody, I'm assuming we can just follow in the English as you want. Va'ahevcha uverachecha vehirbecha uvarech pri vitnecha ufri admatecha dagan v'tiroshcha v'yitzharecha shagar alafecha v'ashtarot zonecha al ha'adama asher nishba la'avotecha latet lach. So all the concrete signals of that blessing you'll feel. You'll have fertility, you'll have success in the field, you'll be able to produce not only for your own sustenance but also to increase your wealth. Your livestock will do well. It's all going to go well for you. And of course, in case we didn't remember, it's an agrarian society, so those are the markers of success. Okay, now going on to verse 14. Baruch tiyeh mikol ha'amim, lo yeh b'cha akar v'akara uvivehemtecha. You are going to be blessed, mikol ha'amim. I mean, right there is, I can feel all my Reconstructionist hackles are, don't start with that language. Baruch tiyeh mikol ha'amim. You will be blessed mikol, from among all other nations. So you are going to be singled out. Let's keep going. Verse 15. V'hesir Adonai mimcha kol choli v'chol madvei mitzrayim haraim asher yadata lo yasimam bach unetanam b'chol sonecha. You're going to be protected from all affliction, and you're not going to have to suffer the dreadful diseases of Egypt. And it's so interesting. If you accept the notion, this is just me talking now, if you accept the notion that this scroll of Deuteronomy was perhaps compiled during a time when Judah, as we were just reading in Kings 22, Judah was looking with enormous concern towards Egypt. Not because Egypt was going to come back and enslave them, well, not as they were enslaved in the book of Shemot, but in a whole new season of being a serf state. You know, Egypt would have liked to say, Judah, you belong to us, you have to follow what we say. Babylonia wanted the same thing, and so there's constant conflict there. Okay, going to the end of this now, verse 16. V'achalta et kol ha'amim asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach, lo tachos incha alehem, velo ta'avod et Elohehem kimokeshu lach. So you are going to be able to overcome your enemies. And when you do so, you're not going to be seduced into following their religions. You stick with your own. Okay? So a strong statement is being made here about the role that the children of Israel have in the larger, again, landscape of humanity. They are blessed above all other people. Okay, let's keep going now. Maybe a different reader, Shlomo, or maybe someone else who feels comfortable in the Hebrew. I'd like for us to hear this Hebrew. I don't know, Kevin or Marcia, maybe?
I'll read.
Okay, great.
You want me to read from Pasuk Yud Bet?
Yes, please.
V'ata Yisrael, ma Adonai Elohecha shoel me'imach, ki im li yira et Adonai Elohecha, lalechet b'chol drachav, ul'ahava oto, la'avod et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavecha u'v'chol nafshecha.
Okay, pause just for a second before you go on. Just hear this. Does this not sound like Hosea that we had just recently
Yeah.
in the Haftarah? We had just 2.5 weeks ago. What does God want from you? Here's the Deuteronomist version. Okay, Shlomo, would you keep going?
Lishmor et mitzvot Adonai v'et chukotav asher anochi mitzavcha hayom l'tov lach. Ein l'Adonai Elohecha hashamayim u'shmei hashamayim haaretz v'chol asher ba. Rak ba'avotecha chashak Adonai l'ahava otam, v'yivchar b'zar'am achareihem, b'chem mikol ha'amim kayom hazeh.
Okay, thank you. Pause again. Let's just unpack this for a second. Verse 15. Your ancestors were the object of love, or the relationship of love with Yod He Vav He, and since you descended from them, you also are going to be part of their covenant of blessing. So the question is going to come up here about, like, is there anything you, children of Israel, have to do to uphold this blessing, or you're just chosen and that's it? So don't answer that yet. Let's keep going. So Shlomo, will you keep going now? Verse 16.
Umaltem et orlat levavchem ve'orpechem lo tekashu od. Ki Adonai Elohechem hu Elohei ha'Elohim, v'Adonai ha'Adonim, ha'el ha'gadol, ha'gibor v'hanora, asher lo yisa panim v'lo yikach shochad. Oseh mishpat yatom v'almana, v'ohev ger latet lo lechem v'simla. V'ahavtem et hager ki gerim heitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. Et Adonai Elohecha tira oto ta'avod uvo tidbak uvishmo tishaveya.
Kol hakavod. Thank you. Okay, so I don't know. I'm just curious. Are any of you seeing any requirements? Are there any conditions for this status of chosenness? What would you say? Anybody, just jump in. Beth, looks like you're shaking your head.
Remain true to God's commandments. I think that's the way it opened up, that if you follow God's commandments and everything that he's telling you, all of this good will happen to you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there is some requirement. Go ahead, Beth.
So the requirement is that you obey the commandments, but it seems like it's almost like you're still chosen whether you obey them or not. It's just if you obey them, then all this good will happen. So I'm not sure that I'm seeing something that says, like, I don't know. My grasp of the Hebrew is non-existent, so I can't tell. But what is God asking of you? Revere God, walk in divine paths, love and serve your God with all your heart and soul, keep the commandments. But I don't hear, if you don't do that, then you won't be chosen. It was to your ancestors that Adonai was drawn out of love for them. And it feels to me like that reads, again, I'm only working in the English here, but that feels to me like it reads from, this is like a gift to you from your ancestors.
Yes. Okay, good. Hold on to that. So my thing is showing that two other people have their hands raised, but I don't see who you are. Marcia or Kevin, were you gonna?
I have my, it's
Oh,
Audrey. I have my,
Audrey and okay.
yes.
So go ahead and then Marcia or Kevin, whoever's.
So, excuse my ignorance, but this sounds like this is part of the Shema, where if you do this, then good things will happen, but if you don't, you won't. So, like, isn't there a part two that says, that maybe we'll get to, that says if you don't do this, then you will be cursed, and your grapes won't grow, and all those things will happen?
Right. The
Okay,
part we're looking at here doesn't articulate any of that, but for sure,
it's
you're
coming.
well, it's coming, and it was also in the earlier in the Torah. See, so
Okay,
yes, other places there are some conditions, but here we
okay,
don't have that.
okay.
Okay. Kol hakavod for noticing. Okay. Teichmans, I don't know which one of you is jumping in here, whichever, or both.
Sorry. I thought Marcia had something, but she didn't. My fault.
No? Okay. Luther, go ahead.
Almost like a chicken and egg uh, conundrum here.
Hmm.
Are you loved because you do these things, or do you do these things because, after all, I love you?
Mm-hmm.
It reads more like the latter to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think you're so let me go ahead because we're gonna look at a little bit of Shai Held now. So Shai Held, one of the, I think I don't remember what his title is, but he's one of the leaders of Hadar. And he writes about this question in his commentary to Parashat Devarim, the first parasha of the Book of Devarim. So let's see what he has to say. Maybe another reader here? I don't know. Bob Barkin, do you want to read?
Sure. God is the God of the whole world and of all humanity. And yet one cannot get around the fact that one of the central claims of the Torah as a whole is that God has fallen in love with and entered into an eternal covenant with Abraham and his descendants through Isaac and then Jacob. Biblical theology is thus at once profoundly universalistic and unabashedly particularistic. Reading Deuteronomy once gets the sense, one gets, right?
Yes, sorry, one gets the sense.
Reading Deuteronomy, one gets the sense that Israel is at once startled and delighted by God's love, almost like a young lover who is overwhelmed by his good fortune and cannot quite believe that his beloved really loves him.
Okay. Hold on 1 second, Bob. I just want to dwell on this for just a second. So he's saying, you can't really get around the question of divine election when you look at the Tanakh, when you look at the Torah at least. Starting from Abraham, and then it gets repeated, the statement gets repeated many different times. I mean, I'm bringing it up here in Devarim because we're looking at Devarim today, but we could find places. It comes up in Exodus, I will lift you up on the wings of eagles, you will be my chosen above all other nations, among all other nations. So Shai Held looks like he's starting to ask some of the same questions that must have niggled at, for instance, Mordechai Kaplan, among others, but he lands in a somewhat different place. So Bob, will you keep going now?
Can I throw in one comment before I do?
Yes, please.
Because I think it's important about the universalistic, because God makes a covenant with Noah for all of people, and then it gets funneled down. And so that all people are beloved by God, but you especially. It's sort of like that's the chosenness is, yes, I love everyone, but it's like the favorite son.
I love my other children, but I love you more.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Shlomo.
Yeah, I just want to ask. I mean, I've often heard that it's not only that we are chosen, but that the Jews were chosen for a purpose. And the purpose was I mean, it's not just I'm going to love you only. It's what really we began with, chosen to bring all of these social laws and other laws to society, to the rest of the nations. And so it's not only a free love, but there are responsibilities that come with it.
Mm-hmm.
Could I throw in a completely different perspective? I
Please.
wonder if the Deuteronomist is prepping the people of Judah for loss of independence. If the purpose of the document is to say, we're going to get subdued, we're going to end up as a tributary nation to some larger empire, which is the trend of the era. We may even end up in a diaspora as exiles, but we're still going to be special. God's still going to love us, and we still have to keep ourselves separate. That, in fact, it's prophetic without saying it's prophetic.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't know. I don't know how much we can assume that whoever the Deuteronomist was,
How much he knew or she knew about the future.
Right, because at least if we were to go back to the passage from 2 Kings that we looked at the top of the hour, it looks like Josiah and his whole court are still invested in the idea that they're going to prevail. I mean, remember, like Josiah dies trying to hold his kingdom together. He dies in battle because he believes you can only go into battle like that if you believe you might win. If you know that it's all going to be over and you have to give up, then why would you sacrifice your life for that? I think. So I don't know. I think it's a really interesting question, and to me, it also it pokes at the related question of, well, when was this text composed? Was it composed during that time of Josiah, or was it then, or retrofitted by some later author? As Matt, I think you were saying before, putting the seal of an earlier time on it is as if to give it some historical gravitas or validity.
Right, like Mormons, right? Oops, did I say that?
Or like we've done. I mean, if you look at the Zohar, it says all over the Zohar, oh, it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai at the turn of the millennium. It was certainly not written then. I mean, no offense to anyone who believes what it says, but it was certainly written in the 12th century CE. And somebody said, oh, it's like when we say, oh, this text was written last week, but I'm going to put George Washington's signature on it and make it sound, like it's something more important and historically weighty. Luther, go ahead.
Well, if the Deuteronomist is writing in the time of Hosea, then there already has been a diaspora. So regardless of whether they thought they would prevail, because the other 10 tribes are already gone.
The northern kingdom is gone.
And they've dispersed. They've not kept the covenant at all. So it may have been kind of a cautionary, whether we prevail or not, we've got to stick together.
Very interesting. I think, Luther, you're responding to Matt's question in a very interesting way. Maybe Josiah, he saw what happened, or he knows the history of what happened. He didn't see what happened, but would have been 200 years earlier under King Hezekiah. How much history was captured and transmitted, we don't know. I mean, nowadays we capture, every CNN has it all minute by minute for us, but in those days, right? Did they know that the history of the Northern Kingdom? Perhaps, I would think so. Yeah. Okay. I'd like to just go back to Shai-Held, and then I have one last thing that I'd like to look at with you. Okay, so Bob, will you just finish this of Shai-Held?
Sure. According to the Torah, Israel did nothing to earn its privileged status. Accordingly, an authentic biblical theology of election cannot be self-congratulatory, as if Israel had been chosen for embodying this quality or that. In truth, says the Torah, we don't know what God was thinking in choosing Israel.
So, thank you. So, Shai-Held is saying, if you go back to these texts, we were talking about this a couple of minutes ago. Is there some requirement, or as Shlomo was saying, is there some expectation or Beth, you were saying, and Shai Held is saying in his view, doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason for why Israel was chosen. It's just was chosen, period. And that's the way of love. You can't quantify love like that. It's just a relationship unto itself. Well, I thought that it would be important to take a look at some of the way Reconstructionist thinking tries to address this question. I don't know about the rest of you, but I certainly found myself drawn to this movement and to our community in large part because of its insistence on grappling with this question of divine election and how we relate to it in a modern era. So I'd like to just show you, these are now going to be just some quotes. These are from Kaplan trying to address this question. And remember that, well, let me share it and then I'll say what I wanted to say about that. And I see Michael, Michael, do you want to say something first and then we'll go on?
Yeah, it's just an aside or there's no reason given why Israel was chosen, but there's also no explanation why anybody is chosen, why Moses was chosen, why Joshua was chosen, why Josiah was chosen, other than God came and said, hey, you're going to do this. And then God says, and you better do it because if not, I'll get you. Mm-hmm. And later in the Torah, it's the same algorithm. There's no choice, no question of why you're chosen. But once you are, for whatever reason,
you're on
there's always something coming down the road.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I'm just chewing on what you're saying about Moses being chosen for no reason. It seems to me that the Torah goes to some effort to show why Moses was had the right qualities. He was the one that he had some internal feeling of justice and connection with the children of Israel. That's why he goes after the slave. You know what I'm trying to say. But
the Torah is not explicit in that. The rabbis take those stories and turn it around and make it a reason.
Correct.
And so we could look at historical figures, find passages, and make it a reason why this person, this scholar stood out and should become a prophet. Mm-hmm. But it's not necessarily implicit in the word or books.
Correct. It's not explicit. It might be implicit, but it's not explicit.
Yes, it's not explicit.
Correct. Thank you. And Matt, I don't know if the Amalekites were chosen for their role, or the Moabites, or any of them. Maybe some scholar would say so. Okay, let me just go to this. Oh no, I did the wrong thing. Go to this last bit. Here. Okay, hold on. What? There we go. Okay. So this is, by the way, this is David Teutsch compiled this. And maybe could we just take turns reading through these? Can you all see these, or are my little Zoom things? Okay. All right. So we're all in different orders here. Luther, would you start? And we could just go one at a time. And I guess I'll just call on people since I can see the way you're showing up in my Zoom room at least.
Rationally, the doctrine of divine election, chosenness, has no place in the realm of discourse from which belief in the supernatural revelation of religious truth has been excluded.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to roll through these. Michael Ackerman, will you do the next?
Pragmatically, it is objectionable as barring the way to peace and harmony among religions and making for self-righteousness and cant.
Yeah, I don't know what that word cant means, but yes. Okay, the rest of it is clear. Marilyn and Mark, will you do the next two nowadays and then regarding? Don't forget to unmute.
Nowadays, for any people to call itself chosen is to be guilty of self-infatuation.
Regarding the inference that Israel was chosen by God to be his messenger to mankind, the assumption by an individual or group that it is chosen, an indispensable vehicle of God's grace to others, is arrogance, no matter how euphemistically one phrases the claim to be chosen.
Great, thank you. Marshall Mazer, will you do the next one? No, you're still muted. Marshall, can you unmute?
Good. Okay. The proposition that the Jews possess unusual hereditary traits which entitle them to be God's elect is based on a series of unproven generalizations concerning certain qualities as being characteristic only of Jews, and on biological assumptions concerning heredity, which are entirely unwarranted.
Thank you. And I would add, which are dangerous, because if we start saying we have a certain, Yiddish cup, as we would say in Yiddish, that's shaky ground. Okay, David Cooney, will you do the next two for us?
Yeah. For Jews to claim sole credit for having given mankind those religious and ethical concepts which hold out the promise of a better world smacks of arrogance and ignorance of a considerable archaeological record to the contrary. A religion is the organized quest of people for salvation, for helping those who live by the civilization of that people to achieve their destiny as human beings. In the course of that question, some universal religious truths and abiding values are discovered. They are not the monopoly of that group. They may be discovered by other groups as well. Religions are distinct from one another by the particular area of collective life marked out by the sancta of that group. Sancta are the sacred literature, heroes, saints, holy places, common symbols, customs, and folkways, which have been hallowed because of their relation to that people's quest for salvation.
Thank you. Okay. It's coming up on the hour here, and there's more to do, but I'm going to just leave it there. I'd like to just close here. We've just gotten a little small blast of Kaplan, and by extension, those who followed after him, in really struggling with what the Torah puts in front of us by way of the doctrine of divine election. And he resolves it just where David just left us, by beginning to say, no, there is a very, very important role for a religious tradition. And in fact, we can call it a vocation. Jews have a vocation in the larger community of peoples, but we don't have claim to this notion of divine election. One of the things that I was always taught about a Reconstructionist approach to Tanakh is as opposed to the Siddur, sorry, I should say that clearly. The Tanakh as opposed to the Siddur is, the Tanakh is not available for editing. It says what it says, and we may choose to struggle with parts of it. We have to struggle with parts of it. We may choose to really distance ourselves theologically or otherwise from parts of it. And I think the passage we looked at today is one of those passages that pushes us to say, okay, we're going to read this. We accept that this is part of our Bible, but it's not aspirational for us. And as I've been drawn to that language, the Siddur is aspirational. The prayers that we put in our mouths, many of which are based on passages from the Tanakh, are there to help us reach towards our potential. The Tanakh is a history. It's a record of the past. It's a record of what our ancestors wanted us to know. But it doesn't have to serve as our moral aspiration. So I feel grateful to these Reconstructionist leaders who continue to put the Tanakh in front of us, continue to regard it as the center of our sacred tradition, but free us from feeling bound by the theology that it expresses, and giving us the space to evolve a theology that we can breathe into. Thanks everyone for tuning in this week. And we will push ahead. This coming Friday, we have Kabbalat Shabbat, and then Saturday night is Tisha B'Av. And in between is the reading of the first Parasha of Deuteronomy. So everyone keep well, and see you soon.
Thank you, Rachel.